We need to reclaim the future for Christian consciousness and to recognize that the first, the first Christians were looking towards the future, looking towards the fruition of something. They were not commemorating something that was past. They were actually witnessing something that is coming to be. So the glory of God is man fully alive, Irenaeus says in the 3rd century. And this obviously raises the question of humanism, which is a hotly debated issue. Let's just say that humanism has never been less popular than it is right now. I can't find any real strong defenders of humanism anymore. And there's a history of this decline of humanism. So when we say the glory of God is man fully alive, we obviously draw attention to the connection between Christianity and humanism. And I think this connection is far closer than people realize. And one of the reasons humanism has declined is because it tried to go on purely secular, non-religious terms. It tried to justify itself. And when it did, it fell to pieces. Just think of the American Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And you can't get a country that's more performatively committed to wealth inequality than America, let alone its foreign policies, which are, in a word, grotesque. So, nobody believes in it anymore. Nobody believes that it's self-evident that all human beings are created equal, or that it's self-evident that humanity is the crown of creation, or it's self-evident that humanity is, has inherent dignity. Nobody believes it. And I think they don't believe it because it's actually unbelievable in the terms in which it's been presented to us as something not like a non-religious philosophical position. So today, when I look around, I see two big trends with regard to humanism. One is called post-humanism, the other is called transhumanism. They're different, right? And the post-humanists more or less are saying, we're just animals, There's nothing special about us. We should stop acting as though we're special. The transhumanists are saying, we are beta neurocomputers, The transhumanists, in a certain way, are kind of more committed to you could say the inherent idea of humanism, but their idea is, okay, now we need to, through digital technology, through advances that are to come, through CRISPR, through whatever, we are going to arrive at something that is after the human and better than the human. And it'll be some cybernetic future with Jeff Bezos and Ray Kurzweil ruling the earth or something. I don't know. We are beta neurocomputers. And so there's huge excitement around AI, and there's all kinds of naive assumptions that AI is going to wake up and suddenly start asking philosophical questions and need psychoanalysis and so on. I don't want to go into great detail there. I just want to look at these two forms of anti-humanism, which seem to be dominating the terrain. And I think when people hear us talk about humanism or Christian humanism, they're going to have post-humanist and transhumanist responses. Some of them are going to go, wait a minute now, there's nothing special about us, we're just animals. Others are going to say, wait a minute now, whatever the human was is not of any interest given what it's going to be in the digital future come of age. So both of these post-humanist philosophies build on the collapse of secular humanism, where secular means, in that naive sense, we can have a humanism without religion. And it collapsed in the 20th century. And it's not hard to find out what the causes of this collapse were. I think we can point to three, for example. Secular humanism collapsed because it justified ecological violence. As you know, I'm an environmentalist, and most of the people I read and work with believe that secular humanism is dead, and it's a good thing that it's dead because it justified the horrors of factory farming, the horrors of habitat destruction, of rapid industrialization at the cost of the ecosystem of the biosphere itself. And if we're going to have an ecological civilization, we have to recognize that we're just one species among many, and we got to collaborate with the Earth community in some much more, humbled way than we have so far. I think the other reason why secular humanism collapsed is because it had no foundations. It is not self-evident that we're created equal. That's why no civilization prior to the Christian ever advanced the thesis. If you ask the ancient Greeks, the ancient Hindus, the ancient Chinese, they would say, "What? No, we're not equal." So once you tried to kind of advance that without any kind of religious foundation, as they did in the 18th century, the thing falls to pieces because it's manifestly not true. What's self-evident is that the strong rule over the weak. And I think the third reason why it fell to pieces is because it's in contradiction to the facts. Secular humanism is kind of this optimistic view that human beings are good. And if we just encourage humanity and, make sure every kid has lunch at school and universal health care and have a nice big friendly state organizing everything for us, we're gonna just create a society of peace. All the misery that in the world comes from the fact that we haven't supported the human enough. And I think this is just plainly in contradiction to the facts. Mm-hmm. In the 20th century, I think the Auschwitz and the events of the 20th century, which have not finished, we're still quite committed to various forms of genocide, just have reminded us that the minute you give one group of people a power over others, they become monsters. There's nothing inherently good about them, about human beings. So I think it's actually a good thing that this secular humanism has collapsed. And I think it's clear to see why it has collapsed. And I think that it should go away because there is no humanism without religion. And there's no humanism without one religion in particular, which is Christianity. Christianity is the only foundation for humanism. And until we recover Christian humanism, we are going to be vulnerable to various forms of inhumanism, whether it is the rule of machines, whether it is return to some kind of might makes right in our politics, what have you. Now, I can also hear people who know a little bit about history, wait a minute now, there was humanism in the ancient world. There was such a thing called classical humanism. You can go to any museum and you can see humanism in Greek and Roman statuary, this celebration of the human. And there certainly was a kind of reaching towards humanism in the classical world before Christianity overtook it. And this is an interesting thing. Maybe this is one of those examples of, as C.S. Lewis says, the good dreams that people had before the revelation, which made them ready for it. Mm-hmm. But the real point, though, is that this classical humanism just didn't work. If humanism is the commitment to the dignity of the human being, to the universality of human rights, to the equality of human beings, nothing could be less evident in the classical world before Christianity than that. It was just too conceptually weak to recognize, for example, the immorality of slavery. The whole classical world is built upon the assumption that some people deserve to be enslaved by birth or by accident to others. And I can also hear people saying, wait a minute, Christians justified slavery too. Christians didn't justify slavery. Christians participated in slavery, and they did so with a bad conscience because there's no justification for slavery within Christianity. You'll find justification for slavery in Aristotle. You'll find it in Plato. You'll find it in Chuang-Tzu. You'll find it in the Upanishads. You will not find it in the Christian scriptures. On the contrary, what you find in the Christian scriptures is a manifest condemnation of that kind of violence. And it was only when Christianity finally recognized that it could not continue justifying something which was so manifestly at odds with their religion that slavery, that we began a real crusade against slavery. And if people want to fact check this, I can refer them to an excellent book by Rodney Stark called The Glory of God. where he discusses the role of Christian communities in the abolition of slavery. They were on the margins of society because the large mass of Christians in America, for example, and in Europe were actually pretty complicit in slavery. But especially among Protestants, a movement began to swell that, no, this is in bad faith. We cannot continue it. So humanism really only gets moving with Christianity. And then it falls to pieces because humanism tries to go on without it. For Christian humanism, I think the best text of all is Colossians 1:15. In Colossians 1:15, which is Paul's mystical Christological text, we read, in fact, let me read it so that I don't misquote it because it's such a beautiful passage. Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So we need to think a little bit about this. Christ is the image of the invisible God. This is a kind of expansion on a Jewish theme, right? The book of Genesis says that men and women are made in the image of God. So we have this idea that the human is the image of God in the Jewish scriptures. But now it's being pushed hyperbolically in a new direction, because now we have one man, one human being, not Zeus among us, but a human being born of a woman who is the image of the invisible God. He is the image of the invisible God. Note the difference here. So in the Jewish scripture, the image of God is a universal. It's like humanity, right? And that's true as far as it goes. But you don't get this claim that there is an individual, a human individual who is the image of God. And I think this note of individualism is really crucial for the rise of humanism, because humanism isn't just a commitment to humanity being the top species. Humanism is the commitment to the human individual, to the freedom of the human individual to choose their path, their religion, whatever, to the dignity of the human individual, to the claim that the human individual should never be the means to any other end, right? And I think you see this quite implicitly in Colossians 1:15. So we have Christ, the perfect human being, you could say, who is now the image of the invisible God. It's manifestly not a self-evident truth of reason. It is a revelation, and it develops over the history of Latin Christianity until it comes to a kind of high point in Renaissance humanism. People misunderstand this moment of the Renaissance, and they think it really had something to do with throwing off the Christian legacy. But all you got to do is spend a little time in an art gallery. You can see this is manifestly not true. The Renaissance, the European Renaissance, was the coming to fruition of Christian humanism. All of the major humanists of the Renaissance were Christian, whether they were artists like Da Vinci or Michelangelo, or whether they were writers and poets like Dante. The Christianity was not some kind of thing that they were just couldn't extricate themselves from because of the authorities. And when they did, they really became humanists. No, their humanism was an expression of their Christianity. And it was when Renaissance humanism was secularized in the 18th century, when it was advanced as something that can stand freely, independent of religion, that's when it fell to pieces. That's when it turned into its reverse. But if we go back to Colossians, to Paul, we can ask Paul this question. So if the individual is, or if the Christ is, and every Christian who participates in the Christ, who becomes a second Christ, is the image of the invisible God, what is God? Think about it, right? God is not manifest. God is invisible and hidden. All we have as a clue to who he is the form of a human individual. And the way I interpret this is that it's absolutely crucial to Christian humanism that there is this unfinished quality to it. That the revelation of what a human being is has only begun. And I want to even go further and say we're actually not quite human yet. It's not just that the human is a completed being that will be shown to us over the course of time, but rather we haven't evolved into our humanity yet. in any case, Paul's perhaps not quite there. Lots of moves have to happen before we could say that, but he is giving us a kind of, you could say, eschatological humanism. The invisible God, and we get a clue, we get a picture of it, and it's this human individual, Jesus of Nazareth. We don't know what God is, or we don't know who God will be for us, or we don't know who God will be revealed to be at the end. Paul's very clear on these things. Paul is the man who's looking towards the future revelation. And if that's true, then we don't know who we are, and we don't know who we will be in the end. We have a clue. We have Jesus of Nazareth, but we don't have the full picture. And for this reason, I'd like to affirm then the partial truths of both post-humanism and transhumanism, because they are both more or less touching on this point, but distorting it. The form of the human is not complete, and therefore we cannot be clearly distinguished from other creatures yet. The form of the human is not complete, and therefore there is more to come, that this human story is going to continue into the future. So this is what we call, eschatological theology, and it's, for me and for many others, Christianity is essentially eschatological. It's essentially a future-oriented religion, and secular Christianity has to reclaim this, because so much of secularism has to do with a kind of future orientation that's irreligious, non-religious, whatever, techno-utopian. We need to reclaim the future for Christian consciousness, and to recognize that the first Christians were looking towards the future, looking towards the fruition of something. They were not commemorating something that was past. They were actually witnessing something that is coming to be. The German theologian Jürgen Moltmann is excellent on this. He speaks about the resurrection, especially the promise of future bodies, that we shall be given future bodies on the last day. And he gives a commentary to that amazing passage in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 11 to 18, where this is the Easter Sunday, and Mary goes to the garden to complete the funeral burial rites for Jesus. She goes to the tomb, but before she even gets there, in this version of the story, she bumps into somebody, and she thinks it's the gardener. She bumps into Jesus, the risen Jesus, the man she most loves in the world, the man who she knows intimately, which isn't to say she necessarily had sex with him, but she knows this man as though he is her husband. She probably wished he was. She bumps into him and she cannot recognize him. So think about that. He is so physically other that she can't recognize him. And there's this moment of cognitive dissonance where the resurrected Christ, says to her, "Who are you looking for?" Mary, assuming he's the gardener, says, "Well, I'm looking for Jesus and I don't know where they put him." And then he says to her, "Mary." And when he says her name, her eyes open up and she sees that it's him and it's not him. It's him in some new form. And what Moltmann says about this is that the resurrected Jesus is the promise of a future form of humanity, which is just beginning. It's just like the sliver of light from a door that's not fully open. We just get a little glimpse that everything shall be changed, including our bodies. And new forms of our bodies are coming. New forms of humanity are coming, which we will not even recognize as human when they arrive. But they will, in fact, be the perfection, the glory, the fulfillment of what's going on with us now. So I take this to be a kind of doctrine of spiritual evolution, if you like. Nothing to do with Darwin's half-baked thesis of random selection. Everything to do with the idea that the history of the universe is moving towards something, and the human is the nodal point of it. That we're moving towards something, some great fulfillment of natural and spiritual history, and the human will be right at the center of it. This is not material evolution, it's spiritual evolution. So what we think what we discover when we look back at the church fathers, at Irenaeus, at the 3rd century, is that Christianity is inherently futural, that none of the early fathers want to go back to anything. This is why Christianity gives rise to these aberrations like utopianism, apocalypticism, scientism. What it shares with these things is this common thesis, which is strange to the ancients, namely the belief in the new, the belief in the future, which will be different than the past. Christianity has more in common with this stuff than it does with any kind of neo-pagan romanticism. I don't like using the word romanticism in that way because I love romanticism, but there's a bad kind of romanticism, and I think you know what it is, right? This idea that we should go back to some golden age, when we lived in harmony with everything. Even if there was a golden age, and there's no evidence that there was, but even if there was one, it's not for us to return to it. It's like childhood. You can't go back, and you shouldn't want to. All the action lies ahead. So let's go back to Irenaeus and fill out the quote. So we said in the 3rd century, sometime around 150, Irenaeus writes this sentence: "The glory of God is man fully alive." And I want to finish out the sentence. And I just want to remind people about who this man was. So he's a bishop in France, Lyon, at a time when Christians are being persecuted, rounded up and fed to lions and that kind of thing. So kind of heroic institutional Christianity, if you like. An institutional Christianity that had no buildings within which to gather, a persecuted Christianity. And he's only 3 generations after the crucifixion. So he's born in 130. That's 3 generations after the crucifixion of Christ. The Apostle John could have been his great-grandfather. And what Irenaeus is saying in this era of decadent pagan classical culture, what he's saying is that you do not understand humanity at all. That's why your humanism is so totally ineffectual. That's why you keep lapsing into barbarism. The real humanism is a revealed humanism. The glory of God is man fully alive. The full quote goes, "Christ showed God to man and man to God, preserving the invisibility of the Father, so that man would not become a despiser of God, but would always have a goal towards which to advance. For the glory of God is man fully alive, and the life of man is the vision of God." So I just want to finish up by thinking about this. We'll start at the beginning. Christ shows God to man and man to God. This little verb, show, it means reveal, right? What does reveal mean? Well, as Heidegger tells us, it means that something that was hidden is unhidden. And in the unhiding of it, we suddenly recognize that it was hidden. See the point? To show something is not a logical moment. It's an experiential moment where a veil is lifted from your eyes. And with that moment, you see something new. And you also see that before that moment, your eyes were veiled. So something that was hidden is unhidden. Something that was hidden to the Romans, something that was hidden to the Greeks. The form of the human being in the Christ is unhidden. And in the Christ, it's revealed what man is and what God is. Or more importantly, what man will be and what God will be. Irenaeus says, the invisibility of the Father is preserved in this revelation, so that man would not become a despiser of God and would have a goal towards which to advance. So we don't get the full picture. We get a glimmer, like as I said before. The door just opens enough to let the light out, so that we now have a goal towards which we can advance. So Irenaeus is saying the whole point of this Christian humanism is that we should look towards the future, to the fullness of the revelation of God and humanity. For the glory of God is man fully alive, and we're not yet fully alive. That's the point. Because the life of man is the vision of God, and the vision of God is still to come. So the whole thrust of Irenaeus' humanism is eschatological. This is eschatological humanism. There is no point looking to the past for some perfect articulation of the human being. There is no such thing. Every form of past humanism is something that shall be forgotten, wiped away, and so it should. because we've never pulled it off. We've never pulled it off. So the revelation is a revelation of a concealed mystery that's partially unconcealed, but the full unconcealment of it, the full experience of it is still to come. And therefore we have a goal. We know where to go. We know how to direct ourselves now into a future which will be utterly different than the past, inconceivably better than anything that's ever been, and rendering everything up until that moment really a pretty botched trial run. The revelation orients us to a future humanity. And so what it does is it reveals to us that we are not yet human. And I think that's the crucial point. We are not yet human for Irenaeus. And so when you give me examples of the inhumanity on the earth, I say, yes, indeed, we are not yet human. And when we talk about what a mess the church has made of it, we say, yes, indeed, we are not yet human. And so when we get nostalgic for some kind of golden era of Catholicism, I say, no, thank you. We're not good enough. Let it collapse, let it close down, change it up. We're not there yet. This is all trial run.
This is all trial run. Also, when you speak of Irenaeus, I mean, I am all the way through this conversation reminded of St. Paul, and another quote that I also actually placed at the beginning of the book that I've been working on putting together. And I would love to just read that for you because, of course, you know it very well. And that's Corinthians 13:12. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's the core of Paul's eschatological humanism, if you like. And that, I think, is something that we can enact still in a secular age. We don't need institutional Christendom to live out of that kind of vision of the future.